Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending our second installation of our Freedom School discussion. And tonight we are honored to have Dr. Monique Moultrie with us. We want to thank Auburn Avenue Research Library again for having us and for producing our Freedom School series. Again, we are doing this series this semester, twice a month for this semester, and we will do the series again in the spring semester. We have very exciting scholars each Freedom School panel and presentation. Our next presentation will be on November. Be in 2 weeks. I will get the date for you towards the end. It will be on November 13th, and that will be Professor Tanya Washington, who will be discussing gentrification. But tonight I have the honor of introducing Dr. Monique Moultrie. Dr. Monique Moultrie is an associate professor of religious studies at Georgia State University and was recently a visiting associate professor of women's studies in African American religion at Harvard Divinity School. She earned degrees from Vanderbilt University, Harvard Divinity School, and Duke University. Her scholarly pursuits include projects in sexual ethics, African American religions, and gender and sexuality studies. Her book, Passionate and Pious, Religious Media and Black Women's Sexuality, was published by Duke University Press and was the 2018 Book of the Year for the Religious Communication Association. She has published extensively in journals and edited volumes, and her forthcoming research is a study of Black lesbian religious leadership and faith activism. Her research has been supported by Harvard Divinity School's Women's Studies in Religion Fellowship, a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship, Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning Grants, a GSU Dean's Early Career Award, and an American Academy of Religion Individual Research Grant. Outside the university, Dr. Moultrie was a consultant for the National Institutes of Health and the Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Transgender Religious Archives Network. She is a content development working group member for the Columbia University Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice, and the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice Scholars Group. And this is a group of religious scholars collaborating at the intersection of religion and reproductive justice. Within the larger American Academy of Religion Guild, Dr. Moultrie is the former Status of Women in the Profession Chair and a former co-chair of the Religion and Sexuality Unit. We are very pleased to have the accomplished Dr. Monique Moultrie presenting today on Black women, faith, and sexuality. Please welcome Dr. Moultrie.
Thank you so much. Let me begin officially by thanking the Africana Studies Department at GSU and the Auburn Avenue Research Library for this warm invitation to discuss a little bit of my research with you today. When I was first asked, I was stumped because my memory of Freedom School is associated with teaching about democracy and citizenship rights. And that felt a bit out of my wheelhouse for my comfort. But I was encouraged to just come and talk about what I know. So here goes. I'm gonna rename the talk, Black Women's Faith and Sexuality, Learning About Sexual Freedom in Freedom School. So I'm gonna share my screen, but the slides that I'm showing are mostly images. But I did wanna give you an anchor point. So let's begin. Whenever I talk about sexuality, it helps not to feel like I'm talking to strangers. So let me help you get to know me a bit better beyond the bio, the academic side. I grew up in a Baptist church in rural Virginia. I was an active church youth. I went to church associations and Baptist conventions. And when I went to college, I took my first religion course and I expected to read familiar stories. And I was actually really wrong. That's not what we do in religious studies. And I'm really glad I was wrong. You see, I had questions about my Baptist faith, about my Baptist church that no one had been able to answer for me. I'd asked pastors, I'd asked relatives, and I still had questions ultimately that some of them I'm still seeking to answer. Questions about this topic of sexuality and Black faith that drove me to pursue a PhD. When I was young, I questioned why women were discouraged from preaching. I questioned why young girls had to seek forgiveness from the church for getting pregnant when the deacon's son didn't. I questioned why anyone cared how long my skirt was, but no one cared where the trustees' hands were. I questioned the president of the National Baptist Convention, and I questioned why he was not removed from his pastorate or the convention when he was involved in a sex scandal. My career in sexual ethics came naturally to me, and I've never stopped asking questions. So not surprisingly, this is why I wanted this talk to focus on sexual freedom. In our time together tonight, I'm going to make some general observations, talk about some specific examples from my research, and then open up for lots of time for questions and answers. So let me say at the beginning of my comments that my areas of expertise are in Black Christianity, particularly Protestant denominations, and faith-based sexuality ministries, which are typically Christian, but not always church related. That's my wheelhouse. I work in discussions of religion and sexuality as it relates to Christianity. I'm also a scholar who has studied Islam and Black women's struggle with sexuality and the Islamic faith. So I can talk to you a bit about that in the Q&A, but for the interest of time and to limit our scope, I'm going to limit my remarks here to Black women's sexuality and Christianity. So let's begin with a historical overview. So Black Protestant Christianity is the tradition that you see on the slide that makes up the majority of African-American believers. Unfortunately, Black Protestant Christianity has been shaped by the ongoing trauma of American slavery, which denigrated Black women's bodies and sexuality. During slavery, both Black men and women were exploited in attempts to demoralize and dehumanize. And these hypersexualized images of both sexes justified, supposedly, the victimization of millions of Black bodies. Enslaved women were often denied the right to marry and control their own sexuality. So when they entered churches after slavery, they were often no longer sexually, quote unquote, pure. This legacy presented for the Black woman, especially the image of being sexually seductive or hypersexual, such that post-slavery common rhetoric about Black women's morality followed the following quote from a Southern newspaper. And this quote, I'm going to read because this is one of the reasons why I went on to do a doctorate. I wanted to understand how we undo this legacy. And so degeneracy is apt to show most in the weaker individuals of any race. So Negro women evidence more nearly the popular idea of total depravity than the men do. They are the greatest menace possible to the moral life of any community where they live, and are evidently the chief instruments of the degradation of the men of their own race. When a man's mother, wife, and daughters are all immoral women, there is no room in his fallen nature for the aspiration of honor and virtue. I sometimes read of virtuous Negro women, hear of them, but the idea is absolutely inconceivable to me. I cannot imagine such a creature as a virtuous Black woman, end quote. This idea that there's no virtue in Black women was reiterated in images, literature, and even our legal codes. Yet these are not just remnants from a much begotten past. From stereotypes of Black Jezebels and welfare queens to the real denigration of Desiree Washington, Anita Hill, and so many others, a response from the Black community came through the adoption of what African-American studies scholar Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham terms a politics of respectability. This downplayed Black women's sexual expressions by emphasizing marital fidelity and strictly sanctioning all premarital and extramarital activities. Black churches were even more strict than their white counterparts. Yet this was not merely an example of emulation of white culture, because such behavior reflects a desire to fight the myths and stereotypes of the hypersexuality of Blacks. Black church members became experts at disciplining the body by teaching that respectable behavior was possible and evident by following biblical restrictions on premarital and same-gender sexual relations. This discipline is perpetuated through policing female bodies and silencing Black female sexuality, making Black female sexual freedom one of the unspeakable things unspoken. Black feminist scientist Evelyn Hammonds postulates that Black women create whole worlds of sexual signs that must be interpreted by their specific cultural context. For Black church women, this decoding means hearing through the silences and sexual virtues imposed by Christianity. When one listens through the silence, it is possible to learn of an entirely parallel culture that suspends expectations for a more complicated reality. Black female historian Darlene Clark Hine was one of the first theorists to discuss Black female sexual silence in terms of culture. She refers to their participation in a culture of dissemblance, that's her term, that was created to protect Black women by seemingly disclosing only what they wanted to of their sexual selves, accruing a space to utilize their own resources of resistance against tropes that castigated their sexuality. Yet this seemingly silent culture was not actually silent about sexuality. In fact, there was a great deal of discussion going on as women refigured their images and created empowered definitions for themselves. To this history is layered misogynistic messages that require female sexual restraint while allowing male sexuality to flourish, while using the same biblical justification. Religious piety was based on biblical instructions, which often accepted some gendered restrictions while jettisoning other scriptures. I picked this up in this concept of faith-based sexuality ministries, but this also happens in traditional Protestant Black denominations. For example, in these spaces, just as I mentioned, it may be typical for women alone to bear the sexual stigma of bringing unwed mothers before the church to be publicly chastised and made to repent for their sexual sin. Members see this punishment as a means of restoring them to right relation within the church and justify it scripturally, going to James 5:16 or Galatians 6:1 as their biblical reference. Yet despite this emphasis on scriptural adherence, male offenders are seldomly summoned before the church. This gender dynamic is also present in the accountability expected from Black female and male clergy. While on the surface, another area of this discontinuation of biblical adherence comes through dress, the commandment for chaste dressing. In one regard, this is an example of the social policing of Black women's bodies in churches. And religious historian Anthea Butler suggests that one look deeper at this narrative to see that Black women called into the sanctified life were not just fulfilling patriarchal expectations of purity, but they were believing themselves to be participating and aligning themselves with the Holy Spirit. They desired to live holy, which required them to be in the world, but not of the world. And this doctrine somehow was best achieved through the sanctification of the Black female body. Modest clothing was the means of representation. That is, clothing stood for something much larger than acceptance in white society. It served as a master code of participation in the religious community. For example, and this still happens to me, church mothers and church women, ushers, they strictly enforce standards such that when women enter spaces, they are encouraged to wear lap cloths or modesty cloths, actual garments placed across the lap of a woman if her skirt is deemed too short. Such standard attire deliberately avoids any focus on feminine curves. I'm a hippie Black woman, so it's kind of annoying to assume that this one piece of cloth that they're going to give me is going to cover the spread of my hips. And yet it happens on a pretty regular basis. Again, with this presumption that this bodily form is believed to be capable of enticing heterosexual men and thus taking away the emphasis on religious piety in the community. Writer Diana Anderson calls this standard modesty theology, as she argues that modesty theology typically makes a woman's body public property, open for public comment and public judgment. She contends that through a misreading of 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 through 7, women are told that they must be responsible for their body as it influences the men around her, ultimately making women responsible for everyone, not just themselves. Self-control is not expected or even encouraged for men. In the language of the purity movement, women are especially instructed not to be stumbling blocks to men's purity. And this shows up quite a bit in the faith-based ministries that I followed. For most that have this philosophy, the Bible is seen as the most authoritative text on sexuality, as they believe Scripture contains all they need to know about sex. Thus, following the Bible's instructions on sexual purity is the evidence of living a sanctified life. Relying on scriptures from 1 Corinthians 6, 18 through 20, 1 Thessalonians 4, 3 through 8, Romans 6, 19 through 22, Romans 12, 1 through 2, evangelical believers argue that believing bodies are sanctified through restraint so that the believer can follow God's will. Yet, women are the target audience. As you see in this image, this is a sea of women that are the believers in this message, and they are given the messages not only about modification of their dress, but also about the submission of their bodies. Given these abundant messages on sexuality that really have served to prescribe Black women's religious and sexual performance, what do women do? I've spent the last 15 years studying Black women's responses to faith and sexuality, and for the rest of my time, I want to give you some of the lessons that I've learned. So first, my research began with Prophetess Juanita Bynum, who may be familiar for some of you as a local televangelist who used to have a church outside of Atlanta, or from her notable sermon term video, No More Sheets. As a college-age student, I was fascinated by her revealing tale of sexual anguish and desire that fueled my exploration of other faith-based sexuality ministries that provided messages to Black women about their faith and sexuality. So in my book, Passionate and Pious, Religious Media and Black Women's Sexuality, this text tracks these Protestant Christian ministries that were made for heterosexual Black women by other heterosexual Black women. So I follow 4 ministries: the Wives in Waiting group, the Pinky Promise group, which is another Atlanta-based movement, Michelle McKinney Hammond's Heart Wing Ministry, and the Soulmate documentary. Basically, what I find from this text is that the religious media typically occurs, this type of religious media typically occurs outside of traditional Black church settings, allowing the books and the classes and the internet dating sites and all of this to be a cumulative effect, to give messages on a pretty regular basis, on a constant basis, about faith and sexual agency. So in my project, I attended these events. So this is an image of me and the founder, Heather Lindsay, and the founder of Pinky Promise. I also attended Wives in Waiting groups. I conducted virtual and in-person ethnographic research with 30 Black women ages 18 through 81. I did those interviews in Nashville, which is where I'm currently speaking to you from, Atlanta when I was in town, and my hometown of rural Chatham, Virginia, and Boston, Massachusetts, as I was interested in studying how everyday Black women receive messages about sexuality from these female religious leaders. So if you go back to what the book tries to accomplish, part 1 of the book explores the demand for faith-based sexuality ministries. Because, as I said, they're in constant communication, which means they might fear that if they don't, they'll lose their audience members, if maybe the message isn't persuasive enough to keep you on track. Through close reading of their messages and focus group interviews with Black women participants, I explored what it meant for Black women to seek out celibacy movements, where leaders' messages of sexual frustration and angst spoke to more than just marginalized Christian singles. The second half of the book presents several agential situations, namely same-sex desire, senior sexual expression, and sexual pleasure. I was curious if religious media was relevant for women over the age of 50, as I was targeting, I was interested in targeting women for whom marriage may no longer be a goal. And I was particularly invested in interpreting the numerous messages about sexual pleasure found within these faith-based ministries. When I took to my subjects to ask questions, they were not bashful in talking about sexual taboos, which shouldn't be shocking, but rather than just critiquing the faith-based ministries that I was witnessing, I wanted to highlight sexual pleasure as a site for Black women's sexual freedom. The masterful Marvin Gaye sang about sexual healing that helped relieve the mind and felt so good to the body. Marvin, the son of a minister, had somehow found a way to merge the body, mind, and soul through sexuality. And that's not just a possibility in the world. These ministries taught that saved saints could do that too. So I noticed in the dating sites that I have up on the screen that they were teaching that if you followed the biblical courtship model, if you followed their philosophy, that they too could help you reach sexual healing and sexual freedom. Yet I want to outline what I actually saw happening, because they told you that this could occur, but I found that sexual freedom happened more often in 3 particular steps. Step 1 was through proclaiming sexuality as God's good gift. Step 2 came through advocating for responsible sexual agency. And finally, step 3 came through embracing the necessity of sexual pleasure as a mechanism for living freely in a world that negates our God-given rights. So let's start with step 1, God's gift to humanity as sexuality. My working definition of sexuality involves various identities, relationships, sexual desires, and behaviors, but not all of these are housed in our bodies. Kelly Brown Douglas taught in her groundbreaking text, Sexuality in the Black Church, that Christianity historically saw sexuality as negative due to early church fathers understanding that the flesh, the body, was corruptible, it was bad, and that the spirit, the Holy Spirit, was the thing to be preserved. That was pristine. Yet Kelly Brown Douglas argues that the incarnation of Jesus Christ suggests the embodiment, Jesus coming in a bodily form, suggests a very different interpretation of the body. Douglas states that the fact that Christ came in a human body calls for an appreciation of the whole human body as a gift from God. In Toni Morrison's historical retelling of our slave ancestors remembering their bodies, when she gets them outside of the gaze of whites, she reminds them of the goodness of their bodies. She preaches to them in the clearing. In this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard, because yonder they do not love your flesh, they despise it. This is flesh I'm talking about, flesh that needs to be loved. Baby Sug's sermon is a reminder to Christian women of the holiness of their bodies and thus the holiness of their sexuality, which requires being comfortable in one's body despite whatever perceived limitations and faults it may have. Some Black Christians define holy sexuality as reflecting the diversity of God's good gift, meaning sexuality is expressed in a numerous number of ways, including same-sex desire. While the focus on this talk is on heterosexuality, I thought I'd flip it up. I've been working for the last year on a book on Black lesbians and faith perspectives. While I'm focusing here on heterosexual Christianity, I'm happy in the Q&A to discuss the various ways people read the Bible to garner their sexual values. In addition to hearing about the goodness of the body and the goodness of sexuality, Black women can find the goodness of sexual agency. Black Christian women hear sermons all the time about following God's will by reading the Bible, praying fervently, and listening for God's voice. Yet they are often led to their own devices when it comes to enacting sexual agency. Other than prescriptions of what not to do, Black churches have not always been as clear with empowering members on how to be sexual agents. Reverend Dr. Susan Newman has a wonderful text that I recommend. It's called "Oh God, a Black Woman's Guide to Sexuality." I think it's something in the title. And she states that when the Black church is able to talk honestly about sex, to teach about sex, and to preach from the pulpit about issues related to sex, then we'll actually be able to see these wonderful changes that are necessary in the Black community. Because our new sexual ethics should be based on believing that we have freedom. We have freedom to choose how to express ourselves sexually. Sexual agency as the ability to express one's sexuality and freely choose sexual partners remains linked to the responsibility of one's actions and choices. While agency must be freely asserted, because without this, it's not really a choice, this is done with the awareness that with great freedom comes often great consequence. Thus, religious spaces should not dictate Black female sexuality, but merely remind Black people that there is liberty to take action with whom one chooses and who also chooses you, with an understanding that this is able to equip Black people in such a way that their choices are made with a guiding frame that reminds them of their divinely created status as sexual beings. Sexual agency expresses how people make sexual decisions, and this includes the decision not to engage in sexual relations. When I first started researching sexuality in Black churches, I conducted interviews with everyday Black women to get their input. One of my interviewees was Nick, who expressed her sexual agency as freedom in Christ. She was reared in a Pentecostal environment and felt that the Black church could be experienced as oppressive because of its legalism and its prohibitions. She suggested that people seldom talk about the freedom to choose celibacy, and that for her, it wasn't about restrictions. According to Nick, and I'm quoting her, "I have the freedom to choose not to have sex. There are guys that I would love to have sex with, but I choose not to. That's freedom, and I don't feel bound or upset about it. Sex is not what I want to do to honor God, so it's not what I'm going to do." End quote. While the book focused on Black women's participation in celibacy movements, it also discussed sexual agency as expressed via monogamous and non-monogamous sexual expression. My participants' life experiences demonstrated that sexuality must be discussed outside of shallow conversations around monogamy and Black marriage. Black women of faith experiences with sexual agency also requires engagement with sexual pleasure. Now, this is usually when people twist their pearls, adjust their hearing aids, or get ready to blush. But if we believe that Black believers worship with their entire bodies, we must also believe that worship and bodily expression are all wrapped up into the pleasure centers of our body. The pleasure concerns our senses, our body, our mind, and our spirit. I dare talk about sexual pleasure being consciously aware of the stereotypes of Black women as licentious and sex-obsessed. But I imagine, and I try to create, a fertile space for Black women to address their sexuality as more than a history of pain and shame. To unearth these not so silent truths, I inquired about sexual desires, fetishes, things that made women's toes curl and allowed her to moan her own name. We talked about masturbation. We talked about sex toys. We talked about multiple partners. I did so because my research posits that radical sexual honesty and responsibility are actually the cornerstones for Black sexual freedom. As I end and get us set up for Q&A, I want to end with a virtual exercise that I tend to do when I'm publicly talking about sexuality, and I'm going to try this virtually in a space. So close your eyes for me, and I want you to recall the last time you were touched with purpose. I understand this may mean going back to pre-COVID times when touch was allowable, but I want you to remember who touched you. Did you reciprocate? This doesn't have to be a sensual or a sexual touch. I'm just talking about skin-to-skin contact. I'm asking you to think about the act of being touched. Did you have to think back a long time? Intentional touch is sporadic for some persons. And those who crave the connections that come from an intimate touch are here for the moments where we think about sexuality and sexual pleasure and sexual bodies as created by God. I also bring this up because whenever I speak, especially in spaces with Black women, Black churches might be the only spaces where they are touched. That moment where they share peace or they hug someone may be the only time in the week where their bodies are pushed up against another being. And so let's think about that, the ramifications of that. Let's also think about the messages we give to children about touch. Early on, we give children conflicting messages. As part of a child's development, they experience the world through what they touch. They crave exploration. Yet somewhere in our journey to adulthood, touch and pleasure become foreign and sadly evil. Does anyone remember getting the lesson in primary school about good touch versus bad touch? Good touch being when you consent to someone touching you, and bad touch when they don't wait for consent. When those messages come across, you're supposed to teach your children that it's always okay to say no to touch, with the caveat for parents that this is why it's important to never force your kids to hug or kiss someone, because it disrupts how they learn to respect their own bodily boundaries. As adults, this concept of respectful touch has to be about more than just what it does with one's genitals. It's that, but it's more than that. So for me, when we do this exercise, and when I do this exercise and I do it with the women that I interview, my research shows that Black churches offer ways for Black Christians to reconnect with their bodily presence, to reconnect with the bodies of others. And yet we must create alternative ways to help Black women embrace their bodies and embrace their sexual pleasure in ways that are affirming. So in conclusion, I learned too little and too much in religious spaces about sexuality. I actually am one of the women in this image, but I won't point myself out. I learned that young girls and women had different rules for engaging their sexuality than did boys and men. I was implicitly taught that God expected more from women, that they were to control their bodies, to be celibate, in essence, prevent the sexual urges of others. Yet simultaneously, I learned that our bodies are fearfully and wonderfully made. I learned to appreciate my body as a precious commodity, and I learned my first lessons about sexual agency and consent in religious spaces, as I was encouraged to advocate for myself, to actively think about my sexuality and how I wanted to engage others, to honor my commitments to myself and to the God that I said I believed in. My research has shown that other Black women got similar messages and are sexual agents, negotiating within a myriad of sexual messages and decisions. I've seen and experienced what it means for Black women to examine their own sexual truths and to gain concrete tools for living sexually free lives. I hope this information that I've shared with you can help you do the same. Now I'm happy to open up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Moultrie. That was a very intriguing topic. I actually learned a lot. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, please submit them to the Q&A and to the chat box, and we will take questions in that way if you have any questions. But to start us off, I would like to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
One, in your talk, you described the biblical courtship model as a model that is used in some of the dating websites that you displayed on screen. So what is the biblical courtship model?
So it depends. So Pinky Promise, the founder of Pinky Promise, she teaches the biblical courtship model where your first kiss is on your wedding day, so that there is no intimate touch before marriage, before someone has actually pronounced you husband and wife. Because those models of biblical courtship really teach that there is too much temptation. It's like Lay's potato chip. You won't be able to stop. Once you approach intimate touch, you won't be able to sequester those emotions and those raging urges. And so biblical courtship also involves courting in pairs. So having either a parent or an adult, typically it's another married couple that accompanies you so that there aren't like one-on-one movie dates. Biblical courtship also finally includes limiting and setting very clear boundaries at the start of a courtship. So there isn't just a like, let's Netflix and chill. There is I am intending to get married. I am only seeking partners who are considering marriage. And you sort of set up the contract, the verbal contract from the beginning, that if you agree that we're going to see each other, we are agreeing that we're going down the path towards marriage. So it's meant to limit the kind of the concept of dating as it is done in America. This sort of nonchalant, like I'm just seeing people, that biblical courtship isn't that.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience. One, and I think you kind of detailed this in the beginning, but could you go over again what interests you in choosing this topic?
Yeah, so I'm in a bunch of these pictures because I was some of these women, and in various points of my life have been. I grew up in a conservative tradition, and I really felt hailed. I felt heard. I felt that they expressed some of the same sexual frustrations I had as a sexual being who knew sexuality was good. I mean, you've got pleasure centers. You don't have to have, porn to show you that it feels good. You can, know that yourself. And yet I had these very strong messages that said that this was impermissible, that this was not allowable. And so I found a home in these communities. And when I decided to do my dissertation, I was interested in following Bynum. So my dissertation was actually on Juanita Bynum and her No More Sheets message. I wanted to understand what people thought she was doing. So what messages got conveyed. So it's a womanist cultural analysis of the message. But then I was also, as an ethicist, concerned with what people were doing with what they thought she was giving. Mm-hmm. So you go and you hear this message that says, don't fall into the sheets again. And yet in her sermon, she talks about having done all this consecration, all this sanctification of her body, having worn the right things, and yet falling in the sheets again. So what do you do when Leroy shows up? What is the natural response? And I wanted to talk with women about those experiences. So that's really where the topic came from. And along the way, as Bynum died out in popularity, I began to see some of these younger ministries, like Pinky Promise started in 2012, I believe. So I started to see some of these younger women starting ministries that were reaching a host of audiences. Like when I first started going to Pinky Promise conferences, that's why there's a chapter on senior women. Because I thought these women were like chaperones, like they, would bring a church bus full of, teens who were going to get the message. And then I started sitting in sessions with some of these women, and they were like 55, 58, and they were like following the program. And I was like, oh, that's different. I don't know that I would do that, but that's different. So I became really intrigued by what I was seeing in these messages. So another outlier, they talk a lot about same gender sexuality. And these are supposed to be heterosexual celibacy ministries. And so why are we always talking about Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve? Well, they talk a lot about Eve and Jane. And I was confused about that because aren't we all buying the same ticket? Like, didn't we all come in with this heterosexual marriage as the goal? So that also is what encouraged me. I wanted to follow through and try to get some understanding about what was going on in these outlier communities as well.
Well, I'm interested in that too. And one of the questions is, can you say more to kind of relate what you just said about your forthcoming book on Black lesbians?
Yeah.
The comment was, it sounds so exciting.
Yeah, no, I'm super, super excited. So the book is finished. I finished it on leave. I still have the epilogue yet to do, but the manuscript is done. And where it came from was I started about a decade ago doing interviews with Black LGBT religious leaders. And at the time I was interviewing men and women. And I was doing so for LGBTQ trans, so the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer religious archives network. And I was gathering these resources for them. They were sort of responding to the rash of gay teen suicides, and they were responding with elders giving it gets better. Like if you live long enough, it gets better. And so we were doing these oral histories to sort of tell their full story. And from those interviews, I began to notice something about how Black lesbian religious leaders, how Black queer women were leading that differed from men. Men overwhelmingly built new institutions. So they created new denominations. And there are two in Atlanta now that are gay Pentecostal denominations. And they're gay. They have a gay, pastor and a gay first husband. And yet when you go in, they keep all of the gender prescriptions, and women have to wear, coverings over their heads, and they're not permitted to speak from the pulpit. And I'm like, we're going to be all the way gay, but this is the shit we're going to keep. Help this make sense. So I really was fascinated because I didn't see that with Black women. And what I noticed with Black women, and ultimately the book argues, is because of patriarchy, Black women lacked access to the resources, both the economic resources, the planting resources, to build in the same way. And so they couldn't just establish a denomination. And so what they had to do was become co-leaders and seek out other leaders to get the job done. And 9 times out of 10, what the research showed, as I started doing more and more interviews, I ended up doing 18 for the book, was that collaboratively is the best leadership model. And so that's what the book actually became about. I'm looking at queer, lesbian religious leaders as the path for new Black leadership. I think if you look at Patrisse Cullors and others in the Black Lives Matter movement, the queer sisters that headed that up, queer leadership is the way, because what it teaches us is if we get the world just for the most marginalized community member, the world will be just for everyone else. And that's what I find these queer women doing. And so that's really what the book is picking up on.
Okay, that also relates to another question. Kathy Cohen, in her book Boundaries on Blackness, she looks at the ways in which the church and the conservative ideology that's presented in church further marginalize members of the LGBTQIA community, and the way that it had an impact on the rising rates of HIV/AIDS, because people were not talking about sexuality, and because these community members were alienated from the Black church. Do you think that is still occurring today? Her book was published in 1999, I believe.
So when I originally started this research, and that's funny you asked, because when I first got to Georgia State had, now I don't know what they're called, but it was some like fellowship application you could get for like the RIG, the Research Initiation Grant. And so the first time when I was writing the proposal to get a leave to write the book, one of the pushbacks was like, what is the public policy relevancy of this? Like, if you could tell us that Black women who are participating in this they're less likely to get AIDS or HIV, then we will see it as significant and we'll fund it. And the data isn't that clear. In fact, when you look at the data, it's much more murky than that, because, for example, New Birth, when Eddie Long was the pastor, New Birth agreed and got a CDC grant to do faith-based sexuality trainings there at the church. And yet the trainings were constituted with a team of church leaders and people from the CDC, and it was an Emory scholar that led the group. So they created this team, but they forbid them from talking about condom usage. So they had this pre-study where they, asked women, what are the likelihood of you having or engaging in unsafe sexual practices, such as not using condoms in every sexual encounter. And 85%, 90% of the women said that was something that on a regular basis occurred. And yet the group decided that they could not use condoms. They could not give out condoms. They could not talk about condoms in the training. And so there's this disconnect between, okay, actually we know what our people are doing because we did this pre-study and they were honest, and not wanting to have a corresponding response. And that is frustrating. So I don't know that the data would show that there's been a dramatic change. Because honestly, to answer one of the questions in the chat, the success rates of women who follow these ministries, if it is chosen by them as adults, the success rate is pretty high. And their adherence to biblical models and celibacy and abstinence is pretty high. What doesn't work are when they are sort of jumped in, when they are peer pressured in because the high school has a purity group, or because they are in college and their roommates are all a part of Pinky Promise, so they join, that those type of commitments aren't real commitments, that people don't really hold them as their own personal commitments. And so they don't really adhere to them.
So when you're referring to the success rates, were you referring to the success rates about commitment to the courtship model, or success rates as far as what was the ultimate goal?
Success rates of persons who take commitment to make a celibacy pledge. So one of the things I showed on the screen was the wives in waiting, the vow that you take. And so, for example, looking at women who take that vow or who make the Pinky Promise pledge, looking at the success rates of those who have taken the pledge or the vow and who are thus in a year, 6 months later, still committed to that vow and that pledge, who are still celibate. And the data shows that adults, so people who have made an adult responsible decision that this is what I'm going to do, that they adhere and they're successful in adhering to celibacy. But those who are kind of peer pressured into it, or who think it's the right thing to do, their church starts a group and they're of that age range, and so they join, they do not adhere to it.
So are there any intersections between the current responses to the agency of Black women's sexuality and popular culture? So via a Megan Thee Stallion or Cardi B, perhaps, and your research in religious spaces?
Wow, yeah. So I did a talk in August when WAP first came out. Yeah. And it was hilarious because at the same time there was this meme going around where people were telling their parents, people being women whose fathers were pastors, were telling their fathers that this stood for worship and praise. And so hilariously, that next Sunday after the song hit, there were all of these community congregations, like people like holding their head in shame, like I shouldn't have told daddy that, because they were using that in their sermon to like be culturally relevant, because they saw it on Good Morning America. And so, you know, they heard the blurb and they didn't know what it was about. So there are ways in which, yes, there are absolute connections between what I'm trying to encourage people to do about understanding sexual pleasure and being connected to their bodies, are messages that are reaffirmed in those types of popular culture dynamics. Where I would say the strict morality comes in, and I even heard this in a conversation, I can't remember where now, there was a chat going on with people who were talking about, well, Cardi B is married, so like at least this is performed in the proper way, that there's still this moralizing impact of like the way in which one can claim one's sexual agency and sexual pleasure. And that I'm not for, that I'm not advocating for. That, in fact, I'm find pretty problematic. But I do think that there are connections, and I think the closer we pay attention to them, our children are paying attention to them. They're hearing the disconnects, and they're hearing the like, oh, well, you said I was fearfully and wonderfully made. I have a clitoris. Wasn't that fearfully and wonderfully made? Like, how can these two things not go together? That they're picking up on it. And so I think it's forcing people to also at least attempt to be relevant.
Yeah, and that is an issue that we run into in a number of southern states. When I was a teenager, I was a peer sexual educator And one of the things in South Carolina, of course, is in the South, we could only discuss abstinence only. So when we were giving presentations, we used to go to schools and give presentations, but we can only discuss abstinence, even though we knew that a lot of the students were engaging in, were having sex.
Yeah.
The only way we could say or mention, and our whole purpose, we were sponsored under Planned Parenthood, so our whole purpose was try to reduce teen pregnancy rates and the transmission of sex STDs. But the only time we could talk about condoms is if a student asked a question. So we couldn't include it in our discussion. We can only say abstain. And so that is something interesting just to think about the impact of religion on the freedom in the discussion of sexuality. I don't know about how that impacts you're looking at the expression and the participation, but even the discussion. Did you find anything in your research and your interviews where there was reservations to talk about sexual activity?
No. And here's what's funny about that. So when I first went through IRB approval, there was all this pushback of, you're never going to get in churches. People are never going to let you come talk to people about sex toys. Like, you're going to get told no. And so I had to put in all of these, like, my back doorways into religious spaces. Like, I know a pastor who knows a pastor who will get me in. And 90% of the time, the pastor said no. I had a handful, like 3 pastors that said yes, you can, and that includes the church that I attend. The churches that I attended said that yes, I could go and advertise in their communities. And yet, they would say, no, my people won't talk to you about this. And I would send their people a Facebook message, or I would send their people, like I would talk to Sister so-and-so and say, you know, pastor said I can't make this announcement from the pulpit, or I can't put this in a church bulletin. But do you know any women who you think would talk to me? And I had all these focus groups. Like, I had more focus groups than I had, you know, time and space to conduct in order to get the book written. So there is this like policing effect where people presume that we're not having conversations. And yet, in fact, we had way real conversations that I was not ready for emotionally, to think of some of these senior women, especially in my communities, as being that sexually active or being that sexually adventurous. We had conversations. So it was obvious that they were open to those places, that type of conversation. It was just presumed that they wouldn't be. And I will say simultaneously, though, once the book came out, and I went back to the people and said, you know, the book is out, and, you know, I wanted to give them a copy as sort of a token. Like, they were like brown paper bagging it, like putting it under the church bulletin, up under the Bible. Like, you know, they didn't want to be seen with it because they didn't want to out themselves as having talked to me. I did book sales at several churches. And the first time I did a book sale at a church, I learned that it makes more sense to pre-sell books than to sell books there, because peer pressure will, like, why are you at that table? Like, what you, sister so-and-so, what you going there to learn to do? Yes. So there is that like private public facade, this public piety, while secretly like really, you know, after the knowledge. Like I sold out much easier when I said to people like, okay, I can bring you a book. Just give me your address, cash at me, and that would be the exchange. So weird, but typical.
So I would ask that same question pertaining to your new research. So when you're looking at now Black lesbian women in sexuality and faith, have you received pushback? You said the book is done. So did you receive pushback within among mainstream Black Christians? And I'm coupling this with a question from the question and answer pool. So did you receive pushback? And if so, how did you handle it?
Well, there's one way. I mean, in one sense, there wasn't a lot of pushback because it's an academic text. I didn't publish it with Pilgrim or Penguin or some more popular press where it would have gotten more, and it's written in academic language, which is a barrier for some. So a lot of people just didn't read it or read it all the way through to be offended. I was really afraid because Pinky Promise has a very active, they're like the beehive. They have a very active engine
Right.
that is afraid for people to criticize Heather Lindsay, their founder. And I do in the text. But ultimately, I think I'm even-handed because, as I said, I'm kind of compassionate because I was these women. And so most of the time when it has been picked up by Pinky Promise members, they're like, well, she gets a pass because, I mean, she said this and we know that that's not biblical. That's not godly. Because I talk about, accepting same gender loving expression, et cetera. But they'll put in the but she said these things, because I do think the ministries are good for accountability and for teaching women how to be self-reliant and how to be responsible. So there wasn't a lot of negative pushback, and that's probably also because I didn't do as much outreach. Now, to the issue of this new book on Black lesbians, I don't know what's going to happen. My partner is a minister, and so I've been really cautious about how I've advertised that research because of some of the negative stigma that's attached with, and both of us are out and affirming allies, but also I'm aware that can shut down a conversation before we have a conversation. So I'd like to start the conversation with you and then tell you my beliefs, than have you not even invite me somewhere because this is what I'm going to talk about. So I don't know what's going to happen with the second book. I'm waiting till post-election, I guess, to see what kind of world we're living in, where it might be illegal to talk about same gender people being the leaders of the future. Who knows what next week holds for us, but I'm hopeful that there will be space to have those type of conversations. And I am expecting them to be positive because our data is showing that our queer family members, cousins, friends are not leaving their religious spaces. They're remaining. And so if that's the case, they're looking for people to acknowledge and embrace the gifts and the talents that they bring, and not just in a transactional fashion, not just, oh, you'll be our minister of music, but we can't celebrate your anniversary. But they're looking for full fulfillment. And I think the text will help do that.
Okay, what do you think about, what about pushback from participants? So you said in your first book, the pastors didn't really want you to engage with members for interviews, but the women were willing to talk to you. So was it the same with this second book? Did you find new methods or new ways to engage individuals to have these type of focus groups and interviews?
Great question. So the first book, I was clear that everybody was going to be anonymous and they would choose a pseudonym. And I was doing my best to keep people identities not visible publicly. And the second book, I was only interested and invested in interviewing out religious leaders who advocated from their sexual identity. So it was clear to everyone that they were a queer, lesbian, religious leader. In that regard, because I think I started differently, I started with I want people who are as out as they possibly can be. That I don't think I had some of the same stumbling blocks. I will say, now that I've gotten book review comments, my manuscript comments, one of the suggestions was that I say I interviewed cisgender people because of snowballing. I use snowball sampling. So I would interview someone, and then after that interview, I would say, now, who do you think I should go, talk to? And then I could use that person's name and, send a call, email, or phone call and say, I just talked to so-and-so and they agreed to be interviewed. Will you? And I thought that was a fair way of how my study sample ended up all being cisgender Black women. But one of the reviewers pointed out that that's like a cop-out, that is me not doing my good work. And I think that's absolutely accurate, that there were ways in which my reliance as a heterosexual ally to make connections into the queer community was reliant on sort of being vouched by for people. And I don't have as many bridges to the trans community. And thus, I didn't push myself out of my comfort zone to sort of make those connections. And so that is a deficit of the book. And I do hope somebody does that work. I didn't do that work, and I won't get to do that work in this manuscript, but I definitely own my mistake there. And I do hope that others will take up the mantle, because those stories are worthy of being heard.
Yes. Thank you. I think I have two final questions for you.
Okay.
One is that during your presentation, you discuss ways in which people read the Bible or use the Bible to govern their sexual desires. I think that's what you said. So what are some of those ways in which people read the Bible?
Yeah, so I mean, people read the Bible in all kinds of weird ways. I tell folks that all the time when they talk about, oh, I believe in biblical marriage. And I'm like, okay, tell me which biblical marriage. Are we talking incest? Are we talking I married 3 people? Are we talking I have a slave and a concubine? Like, all of this is the Bible. So which biblical marriage are you speaking of? And people do that type of interpretive work all the time. They're talking about this, but not that. And it's all in the text. So for me, what I try to point out is it the hypocrisy of it all. Like, at least have an ethical ground to stand on. And for me, that's where I go back to my ethical training. And I say, okay, at least let's start from the basis of, I am reading for justice and wholeness. And because that is my goal, this is how I read the text. If you are reading for literalism, I'm going to hold you to that. I'm going to take the crawfish out your hand. I'm going to talk to you about your summer linen pants. Like, so you don't want to go that route if that's what you're choosing, if you're not going to live it completely. It's like the vegans who are like pescatarians. Like, no, I want you to choose a camp because this is what you said. So that's what I see, is that people make their own meaning making out of scripture in ways that fit their situation and that fit their life circumstance, and helping people see that and be aware of that this is what you've done. This isn't just the scripture, because you could have read the scripture this way. You could have read the scripture in a totally different avenue. You're choosing to uplift this narrative and not that one. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about what in your life has led you to that. That's the work that I'm invested in doing. Because I don't think we should throw the text away. I think it is a text that brings comfort, but I think it is a text that has to be interpreted, and we interpret it through our identities. And so I want people to be honest about that.
Thank you. And finally, if there were any summary that you would like to provide to summarize your talk or your work, what would be your closing statement?
Choose freedom every day. So the work that I do, I hope, is to help people, and myself included, choose freedom in every occasion. So choose sexual freedom, choose mental freedom, choose peace, and do that not just in theory, but actually practice it. And so that might mean taking yourself out of unjust relationships. It may mean removing scenarios that aren't life-giving, taking away the thoughts that no longer serve you, removing the shame that are attached to beliefs that you don't hold, releasing some of that because you're choosing freedom.
Well, thank you. This has been a great discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I am happy that you are able to be a part of the Freedom School series, and I'm going to put it out here now that if you want to come back next semester to talk about your new book,
oh, awesome!
This is an open invitation. So thank you very much. This was great.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for hosting and for letting me come talk about something that was not democracy in action.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. And thank you again to Auburn Avenue Research Library and to the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University for hosting this great series. You all have a wonderful Friday.